London, September 1988. Michael Caine hailed a black taxi outside the BBC studios in Portland Place, exhausted after a long day of promotional interviews for his latest film, and looking forward to nothing more than a quiet ride home through the familiar streets of London to his house in Chelsea. At 55, Michael had developed a preference for silence during taxi rides, using the time to decompress from the demands of his public life and to mentally prepare for whatever obligations awaited him at home. But as he settled into the back seat and gave the driver his address, he immediately realized that this journey would be anything but quiet, as the man behind the wheel launched into an animated monologue that would continue virtually uninterrupted for the entire 30-minute ride. What Michael initially assumed would be an annoying encounter with an overly talkative cabbie would instead become the beginning of one of the most unexpected and meaningful friendships of his life. Introducing him to a man whose passion for human stories and whose dedication to caring for his ailing wife would fundamentally change Michael's understanding of what it means to find purpose and meaning in the most ordinary circumstances of daily life. "Good evening, sir. Frank O'Sullivan's the name, and let me tell you, you've picked the right cab tonight," the driver announced with infectious enthusiasm as he pulled away from the curb. "I've been driving these streets for 8 years now, and I can tell you stories about this city that would make your head spin. Just this morning I had a gentleman in here, not Coctor from St. Bartholomew's, and he tells me about this patient he's treating, a woman who lost her memory in an accident but somehow still remembers every word of Shakespeare she ever learned. Fascinating stuff, really. The human mind, you know? Absolutely fascinating." Michael looked up from the evening newspaper he had hoped to read during the journey and observed the driver in the rearview mirror. Frank appeared to be in his early 60s, with graying hair and animated brown eyes that seemed to be constantly moving as he took in everything happening on the streets around him. There was something immediately likable about his energy and enthusiasm, even though his constant chatter was exactly the opposite of what Michael had wanted from this taxi ride. "And speaking of fascinating," Frank continued without pause, "I had a young lady yesterday, teacher from somewhere up north, just moved to London, and she's telling me about how she's trying to start an after-school program for kids who don't have anywhere to go when classes end. Beautiful idea, really. These children, they need structure, they need adults who care about them, and here she is, barely out of university herself, trying to make a difference." Michael found himself becoming intrigued despite his initial desire for quiet. Frank wasn't just chattering randomly, he was sharing stories about real people with genuine interest and compassion, and his obvious enthusiasm for human connection was oddly compelling. "You seem to really connect with your passengers," Michael observed, setting aside his newspaper. "Oh, absolutely," Frank replied, his voice lighting up even more. "That's the best part of this job, really. You get into people's lives for just a few minutes, but if you pay attention, if you really listen, you can learn extraordinary things about ordinary people. Everyone has a story, you know. Everyone." As they navigated through the evening traffic, Frank continued to share anecdotes about his passengers, always respectful, never revealing personal details that might compromise their privacy, but clearly deeply moved by the human dramas that played out in his cab every day. "Take last week," Frank said, as they stopped at a red light. "I picked up this elderly gentleman outside a hospital, must have been 80 if he was a day, and he's carrying this little suitcase. Turns out he's been visiting his wife every single day for 3 years. She's got Alzheimer's, doesn't recognize him anymore. But he still goes, still sits with her, still reads her the same poems they used to read together when they were young. 3 years of that, and he hasn't missed a single day." Frank's voice grew softer and more thoughtful as he continued this particular story. "I asked him why he keeps going when she doesn't remember him. And you know what he said? He said, 'She may not remember me, but I remember her. I remember us. And as long as I keep visiting, our love story doesn't end.'" Michael was struck by the poignancy of the story and by Frank's obvious emotional connection to his passengers' experiences. "That must be incredibly difficult for families dealing with Alzheimer's," Michael said. Frank was quiet for a moment, and Michael noticed his hands tighten slightly on the steering wheel. "Yes," Frank said finally. "Yes, it is. It's the hardest thing in the world." There was something in Frank's tone that suggested this wasn't just abstract sympathy for a stranger's situation. Michael sensed that Frank had personal experience with the disease, but he didn't want to pry into what was clearly a sensitive topic. As they continued through London's evening traffic, Frank gradually returned to his usual animated storytelling, sharing tales of immigrants starting new businesses, artists struggling to make ends meet, elderly people maintaining community traditions, and young professionals trying to find their place in an increasingly complex world. "You have an extraordinary memory for detail," Michael observed, "and you seem genuinely interested in everyone you meet. Have you always been like this?" Frank chuckled softly. "Well, I suppose I've always been curious about people, but this job has really developed it. You spend your days listening to people's stories, and you start to realize that every single person is living a novel. Every life is interesting if you pay attention to it." "What did you do before you started driving a taxi?" Michael asked, increasingly curious about Frank's background. Frank hesitated for a moment before answering. "I was a journalist," he said. "Worked for various papers for 25 years. Crime reporting, mostly, but some human interest stories as well. I loved it. The investigation, the writing, the feeling that you were helping people understand their world better." "That's quite a career change," Michael said carefully. "What made you decide to become a taxi driver?" Frank was quiet for several minutes as he navigated a particularly busy intersection. When he finally spoke, his voice was more subdued than it had been throughout their conversation. "My wife Margaret started showing signs of early onset Alzheimer's about 9 years ago," he said. "At first it was small things, forgetting appointments, losing her keys, getting confused about dates. But it progressed quickly, and it became clear that she was going to need constant care." Frank paused, collecting himself before continuing. "Journalism is demanding work, long hours, irregular schedule, lots of travel. I realized I couldn't continue in that career, and also provide Margaret with the care she needed, so I made a choice." Michael felt a wave of admiration and sadness for Frank's situation. That must have been a difficult decision. In some ways, Frank admitted, "I love journalism, and giving up my career at 54 wasn't something I had ever planned to do. But Margaret and I have been married for 35 years. She supported my career for all that time, and when she needed me, there wasn't really a choice to be made." "How is she now?" Michael asked gently. "She has good days and bad days," Frank said. "Some days she recognizes me, some days she doesn't. But she's still Margaret, still kind, still gentle, still beautiful. And as long as I can take care of her at home, that's what I'm going to do." Frank's voice gained strength as he talked about his commitment to his wife. "The taxi driving works well for our situation because I can control my hours, work around her needs, and still earn enough to cover our expenses and her medical care. Plus, as you've probably noticed, I enjoy the interaction with passengers. It keeps me connected to the world outside our flat." By the time they reached Michael's house in Chelsea, their conversation had evolved from Frank's initial enthusiastic chatter into something much deeper and more meaningful. Michael found himself reluctant to end their interaction. "Frank," Michael said as he prepared to pay the fare, "I have to say this has been one of the most interesting taxi rides I've ever taken. Your stories about your passengers, your situation with your wife, it's all quite extraordinary." "Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. And if I may say so, you're a very good listener. Most people just want to get where they're going without conversation, but you actually seemed interested in what I had to say." Michael handed Frank the fare plus a generous tip, but instead of getting out of the taxi immediately, he made a decision that would change both of their lives. "Frank, would you be interested in having a proper conversation sometime? Perhaps coffee or lunch? I'd like to hear more of your stories, and I suspect I could learn a great deal from your perspective on life and people." Frank looked surprised but pleased by the invitation. "I'd be honored, sir. Though I should warn you, once I start telling stories, I tend to go on for quite a while." "That's exactly what I'm hoping for," Michael said with a smile. They arranged to meet the following week at a cafe near Frank's home in Islington, beginning what would become a regular tradition that continued for many years. During their first proper conversation, Michael learned much more about Frank's background as a journalist and his current situation caring for Margaret. Frank had worked for several London newspapers, specializing in crime reporting but occasionally writing feature stories about interesting characters and social issues. His work had earned him respect among his colleagues and several journalism awards, but he had given it all up without hesitation when Margaret's condition became severe enough to require constant supervision. "People sometimes ask me if I regret leaving journalism," Frank told Michael during their first cafe meeting. But the truth is, I've learned more about the human condition from driving a taxi and caring for Margaret than I ever did as a reporter. How so? Michael asked. As a journalist, I was always looking for the unusual story, the dramatic angle, the thing that would grab readers' attention. But spending time with Margaret as she struggles with Alzheimer's and listening to passengers share their everyday experiences, I've realized that the most profound truths about life are often found in the most ordinary circumstances. Frank's eyes brightened as he warmed to this theme. Take Margaret, for example. She may not remember my name or recognize my face on some days, but she still responds to music the way she always has. She still smiles when I read her favorite poems. She still reaches for my hand when she's frightened. The disease has taken away her memories, but it hasn't taken away her capacity for connection, for love, for beauty. Michael was moved by Frank's description of his wife's condition and his positive attitude toward caring for her. You speak about her with such love and admiration. It must be incredibly difficult to watch someone you care about struggle with such a devastating illness. It is difficult, Frank acknowledged. Some days are harder than others, but I've learned that even in the midst of loss, there's still beauty, still meaning, still reasons to be grateful. Frank pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket. This is something I started doing a few months ago, he explained. I write down interesting conversations I have with passengers, beautiful moments I share with Margaret, small observations about life in London, nothing fancy, just notes about the human experiences I encounter every day. Michael looked at the well-worn notebook with growing fascination. Frank, these stories you're collecting, they're valuable. They're a record of how ordinary people are living, what they're thinking about, what they're struggling with. That's important historical and cultural documentation. Do you really think so? Frank asked, seeming genuinely surprised by Michael's assessment. Absolutely. You have a journalist's eye for detail and meaning, but you're also capturing something that most formal journalism misses, the intimate, personal stories that reveal what life is really like for people in this city at this particular moment in time. This conversation gave Michael an idea that would eventually grow into one of his most meaningful collaborative projects. Frank, what if we work together to turn these stories into something more formal? A book perhaps, or a series of articles that would share these human experiences with a broader audience. Frank looked intrigued but uncertain. I appreciate the suggestion, but I'm not sure my informal notes would be interesting to anyone outside of myself. You're wrong about that, Michael said firmly. Your ability to find meaning and beauty in everyday interactions is exactly what people need to read about. In a world that often feels disconnected and impersonal, your stories remind us of our shared humanity. Over the following months, Michael and Frank began meeting weekly to work on what would become London Lives, Stories from the Street, a collection of Frank's observations and experiences as a taxi driver, combined with his insights about caring for someone with Alzheimer's disease. The writing process was collaborative and deeply meaningful for both men. Frank would share his stories and observations, while Michael helped him organize and develop the material into more polished narratives that maintained Frank's authentic voice while making the content accessible to a broader readership. Frank has an extraordinary gift for seeing the universal in the particular, Michael observed during the writing process. He can take a 5-minute conversation with a passenger and extract insights about love, loss, hope, and resilience that apply to all of our lives. The book included stories about immigrants building new lives in London, elderly people maintaining traditions and relationships despite changing neighborhoods, young professionals navigating career and relationship challenges, families dealing with illness and financial hardship, and artists pursuing creative dreams in an expensive and demanding city. But the most powerful sections of the book dealt with Frank's experience caring for Margaret and his observations about love, memory, and the ways that human connections can survive even when memory fails. Margaret may not remember our wedding day or the house where we raised our children, Frank wrote in one particularly moving passage, but she still knows that she's safe when I'm holding her hand. She still responds to kindness with a smile. She still appreciates beauty when I bring her flowers or play her favorite music. Alzheimer's has taken away her ability to remember the past, but it hasn't taken away her ability to experience love in the present moment. The book was published in 1990 and became an unexpected success, resonating with readers who were hungry for authentic stories about real people facing genuine challenges with grace and dignity. Critics praised Frank's authentic voice and his ability to find profound meaning in seemingly ordinary interactions, while readers wrote letters describing how the book had helped them appreciate the people and experiences in their own daily lives. "This book changed how I see my daily commute," wrote one reader. "Instead of just enduring the journey, I started paying attention to the people around me, and I realized that every face tells a story worth knowing." The success of London Lives led to speaking engagements for Frank at libraries, community centers, and literary events throughout the UK. Despite his initial nervousness about public speaking, Frank's natural storytelling ability and genuine enthusiasm for human connection made him a popular and engaging speaker. "Frank has a gift for making every person in his audience feel seen and valued," observed Dr. Sarah Williams, a sociologist who attended one of Frank's presentations. "He reminds us that everyone has a story worth telling, and that paying attention to other people's experiences enriches our own understanding of what it means to be human." Michael continued to support Frank's literary work while also learning from his example about finding purpose and meaning in caregiving relationships. Frank's devotion to Margaret and his ability to maintain optimism and curiosity despite the challenges of her illness influenced Michael's own approach to relationships and responsibility. "Frank taught me that love isn't just about the good times," Michael reflected years later. "Real love is about showing up every day even when it's difficult, even when the person you're caring for can't reciprocate in the ways they used to." Frank continued driving his taxi and caring for Margaret while also working on a second book that explored the social and emotional challenges facing caregivers of people with dementia. This book, When Memory Fades: A Caregiver's Journey, became an important resource for families dealing with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. The friendship between Michael and Frank also led to Michael's involvement in several organizations that supported caregivers and families affected by dementia. Michael used his celebrity status to raise awareness about Alzheimer's disease and to advocate for better support services for caregivers who were providing care at home. "Frank opened my eyes to the enormous sacrifice that millions of people are making every day to care for family members with dementia," Michael explained when asked about his advocacy work. "These caregivers are often invisible, but they're performing one of the most important and challenging jobs in our society." Margaret died peacefully in 1995 after living with Alzheimer's for 12 years. Frank had cared for her at home throughout her illness, with support from community health services and the network of friends and colleagues he had developed through his writing and speaking work. At Margaret's funeral, Michael delivered a eulogy that honored not just Margaret's life, but also Frank's extraordinary devotion to her care. "Margaret O'Sullivan was loved completely and unconditionally by her husband Frank," Michael said at the service. "Even when the disease took away her ability to recognize him, Frank's love never wavered. He proved that true love isn't dependent on memory or reciprocity, it's a choice to remain committed and caring regardless of circumstances." After Margaret's death, Frank continued his taxi driving and writing, but he also became an advocate for caregiver support services and dementia research. He established the Margaret O'Sullivan Memorial Fund, which provided financial assistance to families caring for loved ones with dementia at home. Margaret would have wanted her struggle to help other families facing the same challenges, Frank explained when announcing the fund. "If her experience with Alzheimer's can somehow make things easier for other families, then her suffering will have had meaning." Frank's third book, After the Goodbye: Life After Caregiving, explored the complex emotions and adjustments that caregivers face when their caregiving responsibilities end due to their loved one's death. The book became an important resource for the thousands of people who suddenly find themselves without the identity and purpose that caregiving had provided for years. The friendship between Michael and Frank continued until Frank's death in 2008 at the age of 81. At Frank's funeral, Michael spoke about the profound impact that their unlikely friendship had made on his life and work. "Frank O'Sullivan taught me that the most extraordinary people are often hiding in plain sight," Michael said at the service. He proved that wisdom and insight don't require formal credentials or prestigious positions. They require curiosity, compassion, and the willingness to pay attention to other people's experiences. Michael continued, "Frank found purpose and meaning in every role he played: daughter's journalist, taxi driver, caregiver, author, advocate. He showed us that it's possible to approach any work with dignity and enthusiasm when you understand that your real job is to connect with other human beings and to help them feel less alone in the world. The Frank O'Sullivan Archive, housed at the London Metropolitan Archives, preserves the thousands of stories and observations that Frank collected during his years as a taxi driver and his work as a caregiver and author. The archive serves as a unique record of London life in the late 20th century, told from the perspective of someone who was genuinely interested in and connected to the experiences of ordinary people. Today, the Margaret O'Sullivan Memorial Fund continues to provide support to dementia caregivers, and Frank's books remain in print, continuing to offer comfort and insight to new generations of readers who are facing their own challenges with caregiving, loss, and finding meaning in difficult circumstances. When Michael Caine met the taxi driver who never stopped talking that September evening in 1988, he expected nothing more than a ride home from the BBC studios. Instead, he discovered a man whose passion for human stories and whose devotion to caring for his ailing wife would teach him profound lessons about love, purpose, and the extraordinary value of paying attention to the ordinary people whose lives intersect with our own in the most unexpected ways. But Frank O'Sullivan's impact extended far beyond his friendship with Michael, touching the lives of countless passengers, readers, and caregivers who were inspired by his example of finding meaning and purpose in the most challenging circumstances. The daily routine that Frank had developed around caring for Margaret while maintaining his taxi driving career became a masterclass in balancing multiple responsibilities with grace and determination. Each morning, Frank would help Margaret with her breakfast and medication, spend time reading to her from their favorite books, and ensure that her daytime caregiver was properly briefed about her current condition and needs. Frank had created a system that allowed him to provide excellent care for Margaret while still earning a living, observed Dr. Patricia Collins, a geriatrician who consulted on Margaret's care. He understood that caring for someone with Alzheimer's requires both emotional dedication and practical planning. Frank's taxi driving schedule was carefully arranged around Margaret's needs and routines. He worked primarily during hours when Margaret was resting or when her part-time caregiver was available, and he always kept his radio on so he could be reached immediately if there was an emergency at home. Frank never saw his caregiving responsibilities as a burden or limitation, said Sarah Williams, the part-time caregiver who assisted with Margaret's care. He approached caregiving the same way he approached journalism and taxi driving, as an opportunity to learn, to serve others, and to find meaning in daily activities. The notebook that Frank kept in his taxi became much more than a collection of interesting stories. It evolved into a comprehensive record of London life in the late 20th century, told from the unique perspective of someone who interacted with people from every social class, occupation, and background during one of the most transformative periods in the city's history. Frank's taxi was like a confessional booth on wheels, reflected one regular passenger who became a character in Frank's book. People would get in and start talking about their lives, their problems, their dreams. Frank had this gift for making strangers feel comfortable sharing their most personal thoughts. The stories Frank collected revealed patterns and themes that provided insights into the social and economic changes transforming London during the 1980s and 1990s. His passengers included city bankers adjusting to financial deregulation, immigrants adapting to new cultural environments, working-class families dealing with economic uncertainty, elderly residents watching their neighborhoods change, and young professionals pursuing careers in an increasingly competitive economy. Frank's stories captured the human dimension of major social changes, explained social historian Dr. Robert Thompson, who used Frank's book as source material for his research on London's social history. While newspapers covered policy changes and economic statistics, Frank documented how these changes actually affected real people's daily lives. The writing process that Michael and Frank developed during their collaboration became a model for celebrity advocacy. Rather than simply lending his name to Frank's project, Michael became actively involved in helping Frank develop his narrative skills while ensuring that Frank's authentic voice remained central. The success of London Lives also demonstrated public appetite for authentic stories about ordinary people facing challenges with resilience. Frank's book provided readers with genuine human connection and wisdom derived from real-life experience. Frank's advocacy work contributed to policy changes that improved support services for dementia caregivers throughout the UK. His testimony before parliamentary committees based on personal experience helped legislators understand the practical challenges facing caregiving families. The community of readers and caregivers that formed around Frank's work became a source of ongoing support and connection for thousands of people facing similar challenges. Letters from readers often described how Frank's books had helped them feel less alone in their caregiving responsibilities, or had given them permission to find joy and meaning despite difficult circumstances. Frank's writing gave me language for experiences I had never been able to articulate, wrote one reader whose husband had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. He showed me that it was possible to grieve for the person my husband used to be while still appreciating the person he is now. The practical advice that Frank shared about caregiving, drawn from years of daily experience with Margaret, became resources that were widely circulated among support groups and medical professionals. His insights about creating routines, managing behavioral challenges, and maintaining emotional connection with someone whose memory was failing provided guidance that complemented formal medical treatment. Frank's advice was different from what you'd get from textbooks or training programs, said support group facilitator Helen Davies. He understood the emotional and spiritual dimensions of caregiving that are often overlooked in clinical approaches. The relationship between Michael and Frank also influenced Michael's understanding of aging, mortality, and the responsibilities that come with success and privilege. Frank's example of sacrificing career advancement to care for his wife challenged conventional notions about professional achievement and personal fulfillment. Frank taught me that success isn't just about what you accomplish in your career. Michael reflected years later. It's about how you respond when the people you love need you, and whether you're willing to prioritize relationships over professional advancement when circumstances require it. This perspective influenced Michael's own approach to balancing career and family responsibilities, leading him to be more selective about projects that would require extended time away from home and to prioritize roles that aligned with his values rather than just advancing his career. The annual Frank O'Sullivan Memorial Lecture, established after Frank's death, became one of London's most respected forums for discussing issues related to caregiving, aging, and social connection. The lectures feature speakers who, like Frank, have found ways to transform personal challenges into service to others. The memorial lectures honor Frank's belief that everyone has wisdom to share if we're willing to listen, said lecture series coordinator Dr. Amanda Foster. Each year's speaker represents Frank's values of curiosity, compassion, and commitment to human connection. The enduring popularity of Frank's books, which remain in print more than 30 years after publication, demonstrates the timeless appeal of authentic stories about real people facing genuine challenges. New generations continue to find inspiration in Frank's example of finding purpose in caregiving responsibilities. The Frank O'Sullivan Archive at the London Metropolitan Archives has become an invaluable resource for researchers studying social history and caregiving experiences. The archive includes Frank's notebooks, correspondence with readers, and recordings that create a unique record of London's social history. The Margaret O'Sullivan Memorial Fund continues to provide practical support to dementia caregivers, funding respite care, home modifications, and support groups that help families maintain care at home. The fund's programs are designed based on Frank's understanding of what caregivers actually need. Today, more than 3 decades after that chance taxi ride brought Michael and Frank together, their friendship's lessons continue to influence discussions about caregiving, social connection, and finding meaning in ordinary work. Frank's example demonstrates that profound wisdom can be found in the most unexpected places and circumstances.